It is happening under our very eyes. Utterly preposterous when he uttered it, and I found it incredible when I read it 20 years ago. He said the time will come when only Latter-day Saint women will be willing to have children. It's happening under our eyes.
You know, I want to experience my life as fully as I possibly can. And I think that starts with having like a ton of kids, like way more than like Mormon levels of kids. I mean that.
Hi everybody, welcome to my channel. My name is Rachel. This is Women in Priesthood. This is a channel for faithful LDS women, men, young women to study. President Russell M. Nelson's 2019 challenge, when he challenged everyone to study priesthood power. Please comment below and please subscribe. It helps me grow. I'm so close to hitting 5,000. I have been really fascinated recently with a prophetic insight that I discovered. I never knew about this prophecy of Joseph Smith's, where he was in kind of flowing in and out of a state of kind of prophecy. Was found by Truman G. Madsen's Lectures on Faith by Joseph Smith. And Joseph Smith foresaw into the future a really interesting prophecy about women of the latter days. What I think is interesting about prophecy is that it tells us so much about the way that we will stand out. And it also is kind of a feedback mechanism in that prophets will tell us in the future what we should look like in many ways so that we can know if we're hitting the mark. What's so fascinating about this prophecy where Joseph Smith, and it was recounted by Lily Fries, that Joseph Smith saw that in the last days, the only women in the world who would be willing to bear children would be women of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. What is interesting for me is I've grown up in the East Coast and I still live in the East Coast. And it's hard for us to know how unique we are as members of the church because we tend to be friends with other members of the church. And we tend to be friends with other Latter-day Saints. And so for us, we don't think that we really stand out that much. Now, if you live in Utah, Idaho, Arizona, or any of those other places where you are around a lot of members, you probably think you're not unique at all. But I can tell you that even other people, other Christians see us as fairly unique because we are having children at a much higher rate. So one of the questions that I ask on this channel is, what does it mean to be a woman in the priesthood? What does it mean to be a man in the priesthood? And one of the things that I think is so clarifying about this quote, which we're going to get to, is the way that in the last days, kind of what are the most essential elements of priesthood blessing in our lives. And I think that Joseph Smith is clarifying for us in these last days what will be some of the most essential elements of being people of the priesthood. So let's read that article. If you've never looked at the Joseph Smith lecture series you can look at it on BYU Speeches. There's a series of lectures by Joseph Smith that, they're by Truman G. Madsen. I have to say that this was extremely helpful for me in preparing to receive my endowments. I was listening to them a couple years before, and then as I went to the temple, these lectures were really relevant and really helpful in helping me enhance my experience at the temple. So Truman G. Madsen recounts.
Some have heard me recall the statement to Lillian Fries. I'm not sure she was there firsthand. Utterly preposterous when he uttered it, and I found it incredible when I read it 20 years ago. He said the time will come when only Latter-day Saint women will be willing to have children. It's happening under our eyes.
Had said this quote. So Joseph Smith made many prophetic statements that to our last day. Some of them seemed preposterous at the time. Lily Fries recalls one such. Quote, he said the time would come when none but the women of the Latter-day Saints would be willing to bear children, unquote. And then Truman G. Madsen goes on to say, in large measure, this is already happening today before our eyes. So I think that's really interesting because the wording in there is very interesting. Now, note that this is a prophecy that relates to the last days as well. So a marker of the last days will be that there will be a contrast between men and women in the priesthood who've made priesthood covenants and temple covenants, and men and women who haven't. And that is actually happening. That is one reason why I've included the clip of Tucker Carlson, who is known as conservative and known as Christian, that even among Christian conservatives, Latter-day Saints are still known and defined by their desire for children.
Last piece of advice for young people: get married.
Yeah,
Think
get married
small.
and have a ton of kids. I mean, get married when you're too young, have more kids than you could have. You know, I want to experience my life as fully as I possibly can. And I think that starts with having like a ton of kids, like way more than like Mormon levels of kids. I mean that.
One of the things that I think is important about this quote is he said that the time would come when none but the women of the Latter-day Saints would be willing to bear children. That speaks to this element of desire, of prioritization of having children. One of the things that I think we learn about in the Bible so much is this, and especially if you looked at one of my previous videos with Jonah Barnes, we talked a lot about how unique the Latter-day Saint version of Adam and Eve is, and that we really revere Mother Eve and Adam for their choice to have children, to have posterity, that a desire for posterity is an essential defining characteristic of men and women who have priesthood covenants and priesthood power in them. And I mean, that's a question that I think I always ask on this channel. President Russell M. Nelson said, you know, this was the 2019 was a real renaissance year for the instruction and teaching coming from the prophet about priesthood power, not just for men, and not just for women, but also for us together. And one of the things that he says in there is that he would bless us with a desire to understand how our covenants, he said, those who are endowed in the house of the Lord receive a gift of God's priesthood power by virtue of their covenant, along with a gift of knowledge to know how to draw upon that power. I believe that one of the ways that we draw upon priesthood power, especially when we have learned about the Abrahamic covenant and we participate in the Abrahamic covenant as couples, is a blessing of faith and desire to have children. That think about the last words that you say in the temple out loud. There is a blessing upon us as couples in the face of fear, in the face of calamity, and even as I mentioned in some of my previous videos, feminism is really affecting women and their desire for children. You can see where I'm from in New England, as I showed to you my map yesterday, and I can pull that up. The areas of the United States that have the most feminist ideology and most women who identify as feminists have the lowest birth rates. There's a direct correlation between the ideologies of feminism, women who buy into those ideas, and a lack of desire for children. And that's one of the things that's interesting about his quote is he says they would be willing. Now, this was prophesied at a time when birth control really didn't exist. So the idea that men and women could even choose to have children, or that women could even choose to have children, they would be willing to have children. There was this, he could see a world where it would be normalized that people would not want progeny. People would not want posterity. And I'm sure to them that seemed so strange because they came from such large families. I'm sure to them our world would have seemed apocalyptic. That's why I want to share my life experience growing up in New England, where feminism has had a kind of apocalyptic impact on people and the way society behaves. I think a lot of women are buying into feminism in the Church of Jesus Christ in a naive way. They don't understand the fruits of feminism long term, result in women not wanting to actually have children or want to take care of children. And I think you'll find that Men also eventually do buy into that. I've read of many statements by men out of kind of New York City who say, I don't want to marry women who want kids because that just seems like an undue burden on me. Men and women in the priesthood covenant revere Father Abraham and Sarah, and we recognize that this gift of posterity is something that we are charged with to preside over. And that's another thing that I've noticed about priesthood power. If you're given a calling, you're given authority, but that means the priesthood power you're given is to enable you to fulfill that responsibility that you're given. As parents, we are given a responsibility to protect our children, and that can mean protect them from sandstorms like Abraham and Sarah would have been dealing with, or it would have been, I think in our day, it's to protect our children from ideology, and even to pray for our own protection, that these worldly ideologies that tell us that desiring marriage, desiring children are so passé and oppressive to women. I think that the blessings of the priesthood that I've experienced in my own life, I was actually chatting with a friend who's from New England, and I was like, we statistically should be single women without kids. Like, we should not be, having these huge happy homes with all these children. I mean, to be someone from Vermont and New Hampshire I have 4 kids and a husband, that's like having 10 kids in New England. Like, there's just not many children. I feel like the gospel saved me because I was raised in a culture that is extremely unreligious and very dismissive and shaming of family life. And then I was also raised in the gospel, which taught me that there's nobility in motherhood. That's something we read in the Relief Society Declaration. And I was also taught in the Young Women's Theme that we really take pride in strengthening home and family, that's something to be proud about, not something to be embarrassed by. And as a result of those true teachings, being taught those things by faithful, righteous women, and I was taught by young women leaders who had a lot of education. I had several a lot of them were returned missionaries, spoke multiple languages, and they were all devoted to motherhood. I've known women, and I think another thing that's interesting to point out, and I'll probably make a graph about this, is that the church leaders do not mention how many children you should have. They don't. The principle is a desire for children. That's the principle. The principle isn't you should have 7 kids, you should have 5 kids, because every single member of the Quorum of the 12 represents a different number of children. Elder Renland and his wife Ruth have 1 child. Elder Uchtdorf has 2. Elder Bednar has 3. I think Elder Cook has 4. Elder Anderson has 5, and so on and so forth. And so the principle isn't you should have X number of kids. The principle is a willingness for children. And I believe that that's a blessing of protection that comes from being men and women in the priesthood. It's a blessing of the spirit of Adam and Eve. And if you've ever had a very illogical desire for more kids that makes no sense in your life, you're like, I cannot believe I'm going to do this again. I have a 15-month-old, so I had a baby a year or 2 ago, and I was not young. But the spirit of Eve and Adam came over me and my husband, and we just felt this really divine desire for more kids. So in President Nelson's 2019 talks, he re-quotes a really another prophetic statement. And he's re-quoting Kimball when he says this. He said, if the world loses the moral rectitude of its women, the world will never recover. And I've always thought of that as a riddle. So what is something that once lost, the world can never recover? It's bloodlines. If there are women who decide not to have children anymore, you can never recover that lineage. That posterity that a woman has decided to walk away from will never be recovered from. And that's a very scary idea.
He said the time will come when only Latter-day Saint women will be willing to have children. It's happening under our eyes. It is happening under our very eyes.
With Joseph Smith's prophecy that a defining characteristic of men and women of the last days would be that we are the only ones willing to have children, I think it's very easy to dismiss that as unique. But this quote, I was listening to this interview by a man named Daryl Brecker, and he's actually an economist. And he brought up this really interesting quote that struck me. If you're kind of listening to this quote from a temple perspective, he brought up this, he's written this book about like the population collapse, the empty planet is the title of his book. And he's just warning about the problems of no one having children, which is ironic because he is Canadian and he has one kid. But one of the quotes he says is, for some reason, the current generation does not have a value of participating in the creation of the next generation. So I want to say that again. He says quizzically, because what they're finding from a financial perspective is that you can't pay, let's see if I have the next, is that you can't pay cash for kids. This is an Economist article that shows that they're trying to pay people financial incentives to have more children, and it's just not working. And his explanation as to why you can't, like, they're trying it in Hungary, they're trying it in Korea, it's just not working. The population growth rate is not, because once you have a generation of girls, maybe 30% of those women just decide they don't want children. To recover from that kind of population decline is pretty darn hard. That would mean the next group of women would have to have twice as many kids as they would have had just to stay the same. So when that quote from Kimball and Nelson, which says, when the world loses the moral rectitude of its women, the world will never recover, is actually quite literal. That when you have women, especially good women or educated women, walking away from, women who would make amazing mothers. I feel like I think about it differently now when I see cool young women, or I see girls who are just smart and motivated and dynamic. I don't think, oh man, she'd make a great doctor. Now I think, oh, I want her kids in the world, because we're taught that like family life is kind of the greatest aspirational goal of our life. And yet there are so many women right now walking away from it. And we're going to talk more and more in later episodes about the adversary's effort to discourage women, to delay marriage, to delay family life. President Nelson talks a lot about the need for women to speak out with discernment in the last days. And I know I'm not alone, and there's a lot of women who feel exactly the same way that I do. But as women in the priesthood who have been taught the truth about the value of family life, we need to start making sure that we are pushing back on, I think, naive people in the church who are promoting this idea that family life, that children are secondary. I know several women. It's really a matter of priorities. I know several women with incredibly successful careers. One's a PA, one's a pediatrician, and they value children as a priority more than other women with less education. It doesn't have anything to do with how career oriented you are. It's about what your priorities are. And we need to be teaching our young women and our next generation to continue, like, we have the truth. That's what's so amazing, is that we have had the truth and we've been taught the truth. And our temple covenants continue to reinforce this incredible value system of valuing children. The world can go to crap, but as long as we continue to remain true to the covenant, our children will continue to live and to carry with them the truth. One of the things that I'm always talking about with my husband is Noah's Ark. Noah needed two things to happen to preserve the truth. And you could say the same with Lehi and Sariah and Nephi and his wife. They needed the truth of the covenant, and they needed to have children and survive. So posterity is the second part of that equation. When I have friends who get married, I just love them. I always say, I am so excited you guys are getting married because I want your children in the world. It's a new way of looking at things. You have to think about, who do we want to contribute to the next generation of children? We want the best of the best. And this guy, Daryl Becker, is saying that despite they're trying to pay people to have children, but what they're finding is that people don't want kids, not because it's expensive. His quote is, they don't want children for some reason because the current generation does not have a value system of participating in the creation of the next generation. That is my answer today as to what it means to be a man or a woman in the priesthood. Men and women in the priesthood, in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, have a value system of participating in the creation of the next generation. And we think that's not particularly unique, but the reality is that the entire rest of the world is in massive population decline. There isn't a country in the world that's not in population decline. And when you look at the United States, there are actually some really funny maps that show that the future generation of the United States will be comprised of Mormons and Mennonites because we're the only people who are actually growing. And we're only growing at a rate of 3, so we're barely growing. So we have been declining, but we are, like, we were growing at a much higher rate in the past, and now we are still growing, just at a slower rate. If we want that to stay the same and not go into the negative, we have to start celebrating our value system of creating the next generation. That's why I think this quote by, Joseph Smith, this prophecy by Joseph Smith, shows that we are in the last days, and holding to our temple covenants as men and women in the priesthood, remembering the promises of Abraham made to Abraham that he would have seed, and that he would be protected. I don't think that we expected that the prospect of having offspring and posterity would be such a choice, but it is a choice. And I just hope that we can understand how special we are, how blessed we are to have priesthood power in our life as men and women, and continue to celebrate that uniqueness and continue to have the courage and the faith to have kids, have the courage and the faith to encourage the next generation of young people in the church to have kids. One of the best things I tell people to do is speak positively about your experience having children. You know, women who come into Young Women's and they say, oh, having kids is so hard. Like, you're not giving the next generation of girls a great message. When you say, like, oh, you can have kids at any time, you know, live your life, travel, get an education, that's not a great message, because they're getting that messaging from Instagram, from TikTok, and from everyone. Everyone is telling them these feminist ideas that family life is just not that great. And don't be surprised if you have kids that believe you and decide not to have children. That's kind of, unfortunately, my family tree. I have several aunts who were members of the church but were very feminist. They do not have grandchildren. That's how fast this happens. If you teach these anti-family feminist ideals to your children, don't be surprised if they believe you. Don't be surprised if they prioritize career and independence and travel above having children. I've said to my husband multiple times, I feel like we're in the fight for our grandchildren. I want to role model and teach my kids the value of family life so that they'll have the courage in these last days when things are getting so tumultuous to go and have kids and to get married and to teach those children the truth about the value of eternal families. So anyway, please comment below and please subscribe. It helps me grow. You know, I've thought about a few jokes that I could give as to, like, helping you, encouraging you guys to subscribe. I can't really think of any, but I'll come up with some ideas to help you guys, motivate you guys to subscribe. It just helps me grow. I'm so close to hitting 5,000, which is crazy because since I started my channel, I had 3 kids and now I have 4. So it's been a bit, we've been progressing slowly, but I also really love all the comments that I've been getting, and you guys help inspire me to keep talking about priesthood power in our lives. I'm excited about some future guests we have coming on, but thank you again for just how encouraging and positive and just how much you teach me in your comments as well. Thanks. Bye.